one of the dietitians here at Pro Healthcare, and I get the pleasure of talking about everyone's favorite salt and sodium topic this afternoon. A lot of the things that we're going to chat about probably are going to be review for you, but hopefully you're able to walk away this afternoon with some new lower sodium ideas. There's a couple recipes at the end of the presentation, seasoning blends, things like that that you might be able to start incorporating into your cooking at home to help cut back on the salt and sodium that might be above and beyond those recommendations. So diving right in, very often the words sodium and salt are used interchangeably when in fact they are not interchangeable. Sodium is a specific mineral that's necessary for our body. You can see there that some of its main functions in the body are for fluid regulation, nerve conduction, and for our muscles to work properly, we do need to have a little bit of sodium in our system to just have them functioning the way that they're supposed to. Salt is a different compound that includes sodium, but it is chemically NaCl or sodium chloride. When we look at a specific salt molecule, it's going to be made up of 40% sodium and 60% chloride. So our bodies need sodium, but too often we have too much salt in our diet and in the foods that we're eating that end up giving us more sodium than our body needs. And then it can get into trouble, specifically with hypertension or high blood pressure, and then therefore heart health. Sodium serves functions outside of our bodies in our foods. We use them for curing meats, we use them in baking, we use them for thickening, it's used as a preservative. There absolutely are functions and necessary functions to these compounds. We just want to make sure with everything in life that we're consuming them or using them in moderation and not going under or overboard. But do know that there is a difference between sodium and salt. You are going to find sodium within salt, but sodium and salt are generally two different things. We will be talking about recommendations of what we should be shooting for on a daily basis for that sodium intake. But I just like to point it out that they are not interchangeable and we do not want to use them as such. They are two different things. But what's the big deal? Why is it important that we moderate the amount of sodium that we're consuming? Well, too much sodium in the body, what our body is going to do is hold on to extra water to dilute that excess sodium that's in our bloodstream or in our system. I want you to think of imagining 10 little fish that are in an Olympic-sized swimming pool versus 10 little fish that are swimming in a small pond. You're going to have a lot more space. You're going to need a lot more room for all of that extra water. And so our body is going to hold on to that extra water to try to dilute that extra sodium that's in the system. And what that does is increases our blood volume or more fluid, right, in our bloodstream or in our heart and arteries is going to start to push out those artery walls. Your heart's going to have to work harder to push that extra volume through your system. And with that increased force on those blood vessels, both from the push or the pressure from the extra fluid, as well as your heart trying to work harder, can lead to hypertension or high blood pressure. And high blood pressure is a serious problem in the States. About 50% of folks do have high blood pressure, and the scariest thing about it is it's called the silent killer because there are generally very little symptoms. So you can have high blood pressure and not even know it unless you are doing checks at home, or if you're going into the pharmacy and they can do one, or when you're going to your doctor's office, they're always checking your blood pressure. It's because blood pressure is so tightly correlated with overall heart health. When we have chronically high blood pressure, it increases risk for kidney problems because that pressure is in those delicate kidneys. It increases risk for heart disease and heart failure because your heart is working so much harder just trying to keep that blood pressure or keep your body well regulated. And with that higher pressure, it's just causing the inside of those vessels to start to stiffen so they aren't as flexible, they aren't working with your body the way that they should, so they can start to harden. And all of this over time is just going to add up to potential long-term complications. So why is sodium so important to talk about? Because it has such a direct correlation to our overall heart health because of this blood pressure concern. So like I said, blood pressure is defined as the force of the blood on the walls of your blood vessels. Naturally, it's going to fluctuate throughout the day depending on what you're doing. So you can be from a seated position to a stand-up position, and your blood pressure might change a little bit from that. Exercise in general can change your blood pressure, right? You go out for a jog, your heart working harder, getting you that circulation as it's keeping you alive, right? Blood pressure might go up short term, but then when you come back home, you take your shower, you rest, and it come back down into that normal range. Dehydration, just like when we're talking about too much sodium and having too much fluid to try to dilute it, dehydration and not enough fluid can impact our blood pressure. Stress, both physical or emotional. So let's say that you get into a fight with somebody or you have road rage, somebody cuts you off, right? And you get all kind of revved up. You can like feel just the things going in your body. Your blood pressure more than likely has increased a little bit in response to that emotional stress. On the flip side, let's say that you break a leg. Physical stressors on the body can have a short-term increase in that blood pressure, right? How many times do we go into, let's say, the emergency department? Something's wrong in our body, they take our blood pressure and it's temporarily elevated. Very, very common when our body is under some type of stress. Caffeine can short-term increase our blood pressure. And then diet, which we're going to talk extensively about today and hopefully have you guys walk away with a couple new strategies to help really tackle that. Do know that when we are talking about diet and specifically the sodium component, 70 to 75% of the sodium that we consume in our diet is coming from processed and restaurant foods, things that we are making outside of the home or that are coming in boxes, packages, and bags. The good news about something like that is one, we can have more control by staying in more often, cooking more at home, and being able to moderate our own salt intake or how much salt we're putting in our cooking. On the flip side, we live in a country that makes nutrition labels widely available on all boxes, package, bag, so many restaurants, chain restaurants, fast food restaurants. And so getting access to those sodium contents is becoming easier and easier. So this is a good thing that we can tackle relatively easily because the information is out there for us. We just need to seek it out. So blood pressure, what is normal? Anybody that's gone to the doctor knows that you're going to have them and they are giving you two different numbers. The top number, or generally the larger number, is the force of the blood when your heart beats. So you imagine your heart beats, push all the blood out into your system. It's going to be your systolic number. And then when your heart relaxes to fill back up with blood before it beats again is the bottom number, generally the lower number. And this is the force that we feel or that we have on the inside of our heart when it is at rest. So we've got the top when it squeezes, the bottom when it relaxes. And you can see on that chart there that ideally we're looking for less than 120 over less than 180. And this is common numbers for folks that are of older age or that have certain comorbidities, let's say something like diabetes. There might be a little bit of wiggle room in terms of what the ideal blood pressure is, and it could be a bit higher. So maybe we're shooting for less than 130 over 80 or 85. Maybe it's less than 140 over 90 because there might be some other chronic diseases that we're trying to manage at the same time. And we might be putting those at risk if we try to get that blood pressure too low. But generally speaking, less than 180 or less than 120 over 80 is that ideal. And then you'll see that there are levels in terms of the severity of that hypertension or that high blood pressure. And you will see those listed there. But ideally less than 120 over 80. If you and your doctor have talked about a different number, that could very well be the case, but these are just those generic recommendations. Why is it so important for us to talk about heart health? Well, it is the leading cause of death in the States for both genders, men and women. So about 25% of deaths in this country can be tied back to, in some way, our overall heart health, heart disease, heart failure. And if we know that hypertension is a predecessor or very tightly correlated with heart disease risk, it's something that is modifiable. That is one of the easiest ways for us to reduce our risk for long-term heart health conditions if we can get our blood pressure under control and keep it that way. Some general recommendations aside from the diet, which again, that's what I'm going to go into a lot today, is one, maintaining a healthy weight When our body has more weight, more excess, specifically fat mass, the heart has to work harder. The body has to work harder to maintain that larger frame. And so working with your doctor, your dietitian, to get to a healthy weight and staying at a healthy weight can take a little bit of the load off of your heart and just keep it healthier longer. Being physically active. Please remember that your heart is a muscle, just like your biceps are a muscle and just like your quadriceps are a muscle, your heart's a muscle and it wants to be worked. It wants to be worked out appropriately. You got to keep it strong. And so being physically active. We don't need to be doing CrossFit and crazy, P90X things. Simply going for walks, doing sit-ups, stand-ups at home, doing seated exercises at home, doing a bike or a recumbent bike or under desk pedals where you're just kind of moving your legs. You're making your heart work a little bit harder without it being strenuous, without it being unhealthy, pushing it too hard, but you're giving it a little bit of exercise, just like any of our muscles. If we want to keep them strong, we need to be using them. Making nutritious food choices. The thing that we're obviously going to touch on the most today is regarding sodium and reducing salt in the diet and therefore reducing sodium intake. In terms of alcohol, we want to drink that in moderation. There is evidence and research to show that when we overconsume on alcohol on a regular basis, that it does take a toll on our heart. And we define moderation as about 1 drink a day for ladies and no more than 2 drinks a day for gentlemen. And then choosing primarily plant-based foods. The standard American diet is not as heavy in plant-based foods as it is in animal-based foods. We think of our large protein servings, meats, a lot of eggs, a lot of cheese, a lot of dairy products. Our go-tos are generally not a big old plate of veggies or a whole lot of beans. I'm really focusing on whole grains. We are going to talk a little bit about the DASH diet today and how it is a pretty strong plant-based diet plan. Another diet plan that's a good resource would be the Mediterranean diet. That is widely studied and shown really close correlation with good overall heart health. Make sure that you're taking your medications. If you do have high blood pressure, take your high blood pressure medications as prescribed and be regular and consistent about it. And then with anything, quitting smoking. Very strong correlation between unhealthy heart and smoking or tobacco use. So making sure that we're quitting that if we can. So DASH diet. DASH stands for dietary approaches to stop hypertension. Hypertension, again, being the clinical term for high blood pressure. And you can see that the DASH diet is primarily based in fruits and vegetables, whole grains. We've got some nuts. If we are doing any animal products, we generally want to shade more towards lower fat varieties. So we see things like our low fat dairy, lean poultry, leaner fish. If we're going to be consuming any fats, the DASH diet is really going to want those to come from more plant-based sources like your nuts and seeds, avocados, olives. Generally, we're going to have a higher unsaturated fat content from those plant-based sources. Overall, it does minimize the fats that we eat, especially those trans and saturated fats that we get from animal-based sources, as well as processed foods. Like we talked about, if we want to cut back on our sodium, cutting back on our processed and pre-made or restaurant meals is one of the kind of low-hanging fruits. It's going to be the easiest place to start slashing hundreds and thousands of milligrams of sodium a day by focusing less on those processed foods. Less red meat, less sweets. Obviously, we're going to see less sodium. So there's lots of great recipes online for the DASH diet. At the end of this presentation, there is a website for the American Heart Association, also another great resource for low sodium, really heart healthy based recipes. So what are recommendations for sodium? Well, the American Heart Association recommends across the board about 1,500 milligrams a day, whereas our dietary guidelines for Americans is about 2,300 milligrams a day. What you can see is the average American consumes far more than either one of those recommendations, well over 3,400 milligrams a day, which is very easy to do when we're eating a lot of processed foods. If we're hitting up the fast food, if we're doing things that we're just popping in the microwave, we're not doing a whole lot of fresh items, we're not doing a whole lot of home cooking, really easy to get up to that quantity. As you can see listed in that table, a teaspoon of salt gives us the 2,300 milligrams for the day. Now, like I said, most of our sodium intake is not coming from the salt shaker. It is coming from things that are already packaged, that are already prepared. So taking the salt shaker off of the table is a great first start. But just imagine how much salt or how many sodium-based ingredients are in these packaged foods if only 1 teaspoon, which isn't a whole lot, is going to give us those 2,300 milligrams. This is another really common question I get about sea salt versus table salt. I have folks say, well, isn't sea salt better for me? Isn't sea salt lower in sodium? And to give you the lowdown, sea salt versus table salt. Sea salt is simply taking seawater, evaporating the water out of it, and what you are left is with the salt. That's why it's called salt water, right? Whereas table salt is going to be made a little more processed. We get these from generally underground, underwater salt deposits that are then processed into that fine texture that we're familiar with, which does lend itself well to baking and cooking recipes where we need a specific amount because that finer texture is going to be easier to measure out correctly. But overall, table salt and most sea salts are going to be about 40% sodium by weight. Because remember, salt is made up of 40% sodium, 60% chloride, regardless of if it's coming from the sea or a salt deposit. The only difference in terms of the potential amount of sodium per serving is that kosher salts and sea salts are generally a larger flake. They're a bit larger in size compared to that fine consistency of table salt. So when we take 1 teaspoon of sea salt versus 1 tablespoon of table salt, in theory, you can fit more of those salt granules within that table salt teaspoon because there's less air in between each of the flakes. But when we do a comparison side by side, the difference in sodium is pretty negligible. So just because you're using sea salt or just because a package says it's made with sea salt doesn't mean that it's automatically going to be lower in sodium overall. So we always want to read those labels. We always want to be mindful and just try to cut back on our salt usage overall. Another common thing that I hear about folks saying with sea salt being a better option is that it has other minerals because it wasn't processed out, because they weren't filtered. There's other minerals in it. Generally, that's more often than not, they are trace minerals, meaning if there is magnesium or if there is some type of other mineral or vitamin that we would find within it, it's going to be in amounts. So it's not really significant, and we're surely not going to be getting all these big benefits that we might get from sea salt by saying, oh, well, there's other minerals or nutrients within it. They're generally in very tiny quantities, and so the benefit, again, is pretty negligible. So please just be mindful that salt is salt is salt is salt is salt, and all of it's going to give us sodium. We need to make sure that we're cutting back overall. So what are some overarching or good, easy recommendations to help reduce salt? First and foremost, anything that you purchased canned that's going to come in a liquid, more often than not, is going to be in some type of salt-based or saline-based liquid solution. It helps to increase the shelf life and it helps to preserve that food within the can. By draining that liquid and rinsing whatever the product is underwater until it's running clear, you can reduce the posted sodium on that nutrition label by up to 40%. So if something says that it's 500 milligrams, and you get rid of that water and you rinse those, you're going to cut that number by 40%, which can be pretty significant. The good news is more and more companies are putting out low, reduced sodium, or no salt added products. And I have myself a couple cans here that I brought along so that we could look at them. Now, I do have other pictures later on, but more and more companies, as you can see here, no salt added tomatoes. So a lot of folks will come in and say, well, I don't buy canned tomatoes because the salt's so high. It doesn't have to be. Depending on if it's corn, if it's green beans, if it's beets, whatever it might be, you can purchase low or no added sodium options and cut that sodium significantly by hundreds of milligrams, okay? Making sure you're reading nutrition labels, which we are going to go and look at on the next slide. But I did put on here some of the heavy hitters of some packaged or processed foods that the American Heart Association might call the salty six. Some of these are the highest that we can find sodium content. These are going to be things like your frozen meals. Think of Hungry Man and Stouffer's and things that we might be able to pop into the microwave as a frozen entree. Pizzas, packaged mixes, you think of things like flavored rices, flavored ramen noodles, what else? Mashed potato mixes and things like that. They all have a lot of salt and sodium added to impart delicious flavor, but also act as that preservative again so that it can stay on the shelf longer. Those canned soups and broths, ready to eat cereals is pretty surprising, I know, but again, keep in mind that sodium is used as a preservative, so it's something that can keep those cereals on the shelf longer. And then salad dressings. So I have a couple notes here. In terms of frozen pizzas, I put pizza on there. If you get pizza out at Domino's or wherever else, it's going to have a lot of salt and sodium for sure, because they're going to be adding salt to the crust. There's generally some type of salt added to the tomato sauce when they put things like cheese that is naturally salty, and then you're adding things like sausage or pepperoni. These are cured meats. Those are also going to impart salt and then therefore increase the sodium. So if we can, choosing a thin crust pizza helps to create less crust. There's less room for the salt potentially. Be mindful about the amount of cheese that is added. If we can ask for half the cheese, that would be a way to cut that sodium. And then be mindful of those toppings. If you're going to add things like those pepperoni or sausage, lots of sodium in there, maybe we do more vegetable-based toppings. Those fresh vegetables, we think of things like red peppers or onions or broccoli, are going to have a lower sodium content and be better overall for you. Interestingly enough, one slice of frozen pepperoni pizza can have up to 900 milligrams of sodium. And let's get real, we're not just eating one slice, myself included, because that's not satisfying. So you have one slice or two slices or three slices, and boom, you're over your entire daily recommendation for sodium from just one meal. You didn't count breakfast, snacks, your lunch, whatever might have preceded it. When it comes to pizza, one little recommendation is do not rely on the pizza alone to feel full. Make sure that you have, let's say, a large salad with that pizza, or maybe you do a low sodium vegetable soup with that pizza. So now you don't rely on 2, 3, 4 the entire pizza to fill up and feel satisfied as you walk away from the dinner table, but you're using other naturally lower sodium options like those veggies to fill up the space in your stomach so that one slice of a lower sodium pizza does satisfy because it wasn't the only thing that you ate at the meal. Interestingly enough, I just read this, that one of the biggest offenders to the highest sodium content in the American diet is bread and rolls. And not because these are the highest sodium foods, but because of the amount of these foods that we eat. So that's also something that we have to keep in mind, that yeah, we want to be reading these nutrition labels and we want to choose lower sodium options whenever possible, but we do need to add them up over the course of the day. And if you're going to purchase, let's say, a loaf of bread that could easily have 200 milligrams of sodium per slice of bread, again, remember, salt or sodium can be used as a preservative. Sliced bread can sit on those shelves for a month. It's not doing so except for the reason that we're putting preservatives in it, like salt and sodium. So let's say that there's 200 slices or 200 milligrams per slice. You have 2 slices with breakfast. You make a sandwich with lunch, and then you decide for dinner to have a roll or 2. Well, breakfast was 400, lunch was 400, dinner, let's say, might be another 400, and you're over half of your limit. And that was just from the bread. That didn't include anything you might have put on it. Let's say you put turkey or cheese or condiments on that sandwich in the afternoon. So the sodium really can add up quickly, not just from high sodium options, but then also maybe the frequency or the amount of said foods that we would eat over the course of the day, when those numbers, without us even realizing it, starting to add up, add up, add up. There are lower sodium breads out there. Again, I brought a little package here from my own house. This is just one brand. They make for a reduced sodium loaf of bread only 90 milligrams per slice, and they make a no sodium added loaf of bread. I think it's 0 or 5 milligrams just naturally occurring. So you can find those options out there. You just need to take maybe a couple extra minutes in the grocery store, peek around at those labels and find what we're looking for. And then the ingredient list. So these are maybe potentially less obvious sources of sodium, because if it's not just going to say salt, it could say something like baking soda, monosodium glutamate. Sodium's in the name. Soy sauce we know is a really high contributor to sodium in our diet. And then some antacids. So looking at that ingredient list and looking for the word sodium, baking soda, soy sauce, these are things that are going to impart that higher sodium content. But our nutrition labels, I will come right back to this one, our nutrition labels are going to be where we're really going to get those numbers. So what I have here are two labels side by side, because we currently have two different formats in our food system of what our nutrition label might look like. The format on the left-hand side of your screen is the format that we've used since the year 1990. We are currently transitioning to the format that you see on your right-hand side. The good news is they both have the two most valuable pieces of information when it comes to our sodium intake. Serving size at the top of your page there that are in the brown boxes. Serving size gives us context to know how much of the food is going to provide us. Then we go down to our label where we see sodium in the yellow box to tell us how much. It does you no good if you only look at the yellow box. So if you only look at the 160 and say, hey, that's not so bad, all right, cool, but then you end up eating 3 servings, you're going to need to multiply that 160 by 3 to get the accurate amount of sodium that you've actually ingested. So please, 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 always start with serving size. Whether you're counting fat, you're counting carbs, you're considering sodium, whatever it might be, that serving size is going to give us context. If you look at the serving of, let's say, a box of crackers and it says 3 crackers, and you tell yourself that that's totally not realistic, you're never going to eat just 3 crackers, maybe that's not the product for you. The sodium might look great, it might be 50, but if you're going to end up eating 15 crackers, well, that 50 now needs to be multiplied accordingly to get an accurate number of how much you're actually consuming. So please, 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 don't just use the front of packages. Always verify, read those labels, and make sure that you know how much is in the serving that you intend to consume. General rule of thumb is that percentage that's listed on the right-hand side of the bar where it says 7%. General rule of thumb is this: if that number is 5% or less, you are looking at a low sodium food, more than likely good to go as long as you're sticking with the serving. General rule of thumb is if that number is 20% or more, you are looking at a high sodium food. You might want to consider looking for an alternative. So that's one easy way to just quickly glance at the label. What is that percentage? 5 or less? All right, cool, I'm on the right track. 20 or more, eek, I might want to be looking for another option that's going to be lower than that. Now, a lot of people will ask about salt substitutes. Well, you know, I'm not going to use salt in my cooking, or my doctor told me to cut back on my salt, cut back on my sodium. Most salt substitutes that we see on the market are made with potassium chloride. So they're not made with sodium chloride, they're made with potassium chloride. They taste pretty similarly to regular salt. Some people will notice a difference. Most common brands that are out there are your Morton salt substitute, new salt, or no salt product. You will see that listed right on there. I really encourage anybody that's considering using one of these salt substitutes to run this by your doctor first, because a higher amount of potassium than is recommended or what you normally take can have pretty significant impacts with certain medications, especially when it comes to kidney health. So whether you are on for high blood pressure or you are on for some type of kidney medication, be very mindful before starting one of these, and don't think, hey, this is just going to be a super safe alternative. Please run this past your doctor or your pharmacist first. They should be able to give you some recommendations on if it's going to be a fine alternative. At the end of today's presentation, I am going to give you some no salt ideas, not the brand no salt, but like no salt ideas, for different blends and how we can be using herbs and spices and different flavorings more so that we don't maybe need to risk this, or if you get feedback to say that this is not going to be the right product for you, that you'll have other ideas to still have delicious and flavorful. All right, so the FDA does have definitions for sodium claims on food. So for example, like this can of corn, no salt added. Or if we look at something like this chicken broth, it says low sodium. There are regulated definitions for food companies to use some of this lingo on their packages, and you see that listed there. If something says sodium free or salt free, by law, when you look at the nutrition facts label, it needs to have 5 milligrams of sodium or less per serving. A very low sodium or very low salt product will have 35 milligrams or less. Low sodium or low salt by law is going to have 140 milligrams of sodium or less. That one is going to be more common in my experience than salt-free or very low sodium. The low sodium with the 140, that's more common when we look at canned goods or broths, things like that. General rule, 140 or less, pretty solid. A lot of times you're going to see that 5% associated with the 140. So if you prefer to look at the percentages, 5 or less, you're rocking and rolling. If you prefer to look at the milligrams, 140 or less, and you're definitely on the right track. Reduced sodium or reduced salt, or lightly salted or light in sodium. Those two are pretty tricky. And I don't have the container, but I think it's on the next slide. This reduced sodium, I think, can be very misleading because it's defined as at least 25% less sodium than a similar product. Well, if a similar product has 1,000 milligrams per serving, well, then a reduced sodium product would be 750 milligrams because it's 25% less. 750 is still incredibly high. So don't just think that something that's slightly salted or reduced sodium is going to be an automatic go-to. We always want to verify by looking at those labels. The one that I'm most familiar with, growing up, Swanson's chicken broth, 33% reduced sodium or 33% less sodium. That was what my father bought all the time. And I always thought, okay, that's what we're going to get. I leave home, I'm in college, I'm doing my own shopping, I turn around that label. It's still like 500 milligrams for a 1 cup serving. Ouch. It's because it's 33% less than its regular, which is 800 and some. So the math isn't wrong, it's just not the right math for me. So I'm going to now look for low sodium chicken broths or something like this free range Pacific chicken broth. It says low sodium right on the package. Because it's 140 or less, that guy's only 20 milligrams per cup. That is significantly lower than 500. And now I get to moderate how much sodium's in my recipe. I get to put my own herbs and spices and flavorings in, and I'm not trying to fight salty nature that just came inherently from the higher salt broth. And then you'll see down there that no salt added or unsalted. Please know that this can be very misleading because a no salt added food does not make it a salt-free food, because certain foods can inherently have a level of sodium or a level of salt just naturally within them. Just because they're not adding it doesn't mean it's not there. Total sidebar, sugar-free foods or no sugar added foods doesn't mean that there's not sugar in the product. You can purchase no sugar added ice cream, and when you look at that nutrition label, there's still going to be sugar in the product. It's because it's made from milk. Milk has lactose. Lactose is a milk sugar. It's a sugar naturally occurring. So always use the front of packages as maybe a gateway, but do your own assessing by turning those suckers around, reading those nutrition facts labels, and verifying, are the posted sodium numbers in line with what your goals are and what your recommendations need to be. So here's a couple other examples. You'll see that Hunt's no salt added sauce. We want to turn that around and make sure they may not have added any, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't naturally occurring in one of the other ingredients. Low sodium broths, or there's my favorite, that's Swanson 33% less. And you can see right underneath it in that teeny tiny font, it says 33% less sodium than our regular product. A regular product has 800 plus per 1 cup. All right, so just be mindful of that. Now, other ones like soups, canned soups are really popular. They're so convenient, but it can be a really big offender for high sodium content, especially if we get tripped up and don't do the math, realizing that there are 2 servings in any can of soup. So for example, this Progresso, it is a reduced sodium, says right here at the top. For a 1 cup serving, it's 470 milligrams. If I eat this entire thing, I need to double that 470. If that's part of my day, otherwise I'm choosing low sodium, okay, that could work. But just because something has that lingo on it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the lowest option or the best option. There are canned soups out there like this one that says no salt added, and for the entire container, 220 milligrams, significantly lower. This entire can has half as much as half of the can of the other one. So please, please do your homework when you're in the grocery store and look up those labels. If you have access to a computer, the internet, obviously you're signed in. If you are, you can look up these products ahead of time. Let's say that you go into your freezer, you go into your pantry, you turn around your frozen meals and your canned soups, and wowza, sodium's crazy. Go online, Healthy Choice, Lean Cuisine, Progresso, whatever it might be, they're going to have all of their products listed online, all of their nutrition available to you online. So in the comfort of your own home, in your PJs, on the couch, you can be looking through and saying, hey, when I go to Pick and Save or when I go to Sendix next, what are the brands and the flavors that I've done my homework on that I know are lower in sodium? So I just need to look for those rather than turning around every single can while you're standing in aisle 2. Just as one kind of way to take some of the pressure off from standing in the grocery store so long. Condiments. This is an area where we can use it a lot for flavor. If we're carb counting or if we're mindful of calories, a lot of condiments can be very low in carbs, can be low in calories, but what they can be high in is salt or sodium. So this is a great place to look for reduced sodium options. You can see there I've got some side-by-sides for some just overarching general recommendations or general products. Soy sauce we know is really high. For a 1 tablespoon serving, generally you're going to find 900 milligrams. The reduced sodium variety is going to come in at 530. There is another product out there that some people have found is very similar in flavor to soy sauce that's even lower than reduced sodium soy sauce, and it's coconut aminos. 2 different words, coconut, just like the plants, just like the, and then aminos, aminos. You will either find this in your condiment section or sometimes you're going to find it in the Asian or ethnic aisle. It comes in a very similar shape and size bottle as regular soy sauce. It's the same color, that dark color. And because it's made from a different product, it's made from coconut, processed differently, it does have inherently a lower sodium content. Some people think it's a great alternative. I will be honest with you, personally, I've tried it. I do think it tastes different, but it is something to try if you're a big soy sauce user and you're trying to cut back on some sodium, something to try out. Steak sauce, you can, like, standard A1. They're regular 560 for a 2 tablespoon serving. There are reduced sodium varieties out there, maxed down to 85, huge difference. Barbecue sauce, you can see ketchup, mustard. There are options out there. So please, please, I know we can get into a rhythm when we go grocery shopping, and it's kind of like muscle memory. We just get into the aisle, we pick the item that we generally have purchased in the past. Maybe take a couple extra seconds or a minute and look around and see, because so many people overconsume on sodium, these companies know it and they want to appeal to the consumer, and the consumer is looking for lower sodium varieties. So they are out there. It just might take a couple extra seconds or a minute in that aisle to look it up, turn some things around, and find that new product that's interesting. So I did, like I mentioned, want to include some salt-free blends. We've got a mixed herb, an Italian, and a Mexican blend. I have the amounts listed out. These are just going to be using dried herbs and spices. That mixed herb one, we've got some parsley flakes, dried tarragon, oregano, dill weed, celery flakes. For the Italian blend, we've got basil and marjoram, garlic powder, oregano, thyme. These are things that a lot of us have in our spice cabinet. And so if we can just put these things together ourselves, put them in, let's say, a tightly capped little jar, or we can get all the air out of like a Ziploc bag, mix them all up in there, mix them just up in the bag, keep the air out of it, and they're going to last in your cupboard for a pretty long time. Just taking out teaspoons or tablespoons and sprinkling that into your foods so that you're getting those great flavors and you don't have to eat bland food, but without having to using any salt to do it. Now, if you're not somebody that wants to do this, or you're like, who's got marjoram in their house? There are lots and lots of salt-free blends in your spice aisle at your local grocery store. Mrs. Dash is one of the most popular ones and the one that's been around a very long time. A very extensive line of options from teriyaki or Asian or Italian or original blend or lemon pepper, lots of different mixes that have zero salt in them and therefore zero sodium in them. They're just mixing up some of these herbs and spices for you and putting them in a container. McCormick is coming out with more and more, I'm noticing, of salt-free seasoning blends. And then to support local, Penzeys has a lot of great salt-free seasoning blends to consider. Do be mindful when it comes to herbs and spices. We don't want to keep them in our cupboards for too long. They're not going to go bad from a food safety perspective, but they are going to lose some of their flavor punch. And if we're going to start cutting back on salt, we definitely don't want to be left with bland food. And if our dried herbs and spices are starting to kind of disintegrate or lose some of their potent power flavor, you might not get the same satisfaction out of your meals or the things that you're making at home. So please consider investing in new herbs and spices if the ones have been in there for, a decade. Also consider purchasing in smaller amounts. So if we go to Penzeys or we go to certain grocery stores, you can just get smaller amounts rather than, a big old like Costco size amount of something, of each one of these different herbs and spices so that you can be guaranteed that you're going to get a whole lot more flavor punch in your mouth than something that might have been in the cupboard and kind of died off a couple years ago since it's been sitting in there so long. The other thing to consider is that we don't need to go from all to nothing. So if your taste buds are used to salt, if you eat a higher salt diet, if you're one of those folks that's getting over 3,400 milligrams of sodium a day because we're doing a lot of processed foods or we are using the salt shaker, be realistic with yourself about cutting back on an appropriate timeline. And you do not need to go from all to nothing because you're going to potentially be very disappointed in your foods. And what happens when we're not excited about our food? We find ourselves falling back into old habits, going back to what we know. If you are one of those people that shades towards the saltier side of life and you do consume more sodium, your taste buds are used to that threshold of flavor. And so to go from all salt to no salt, your taste buds are going to know it. They're going to feel the void and they're going to be screaming back at you. So by cutting back little by little, maybe it's this next week or so, you're going to make a recipe that you've done in the past. And if the recipe calls for a teaspoon of salt, you're going to use half a teaspoon or 3/4 of a teaspoon. And you're going to add in twice as much of the dried basil or oregano or try to add in more flavors that way. Generally speaking, it takes our taste buds about 2 to 3 weeks to start to reacclimate to a lower threshold. So if you can dig in, cut the sodium significantly, realize that some of your things are not going to taste the way that they did before, taste buds, just like any cell in the body, regrows, right? They die off and then we've got new ones. Well, what I call these new baby taste buds, the ones that haven't been inundated with salt and a high amount of sodium and all that flavor, well, they come in and they're kind of like fresh and they don't really know what to expect. And so if we're consuming less salt and therefore lowering our sodium, those new taste buds are none the wiser. And now we think something like Chinese food, for example, is super, super salty because those baby taste buds are not used to that high amount of salt or sodium that maybe those old taste buds used to be accustomed to. So you got to ask yourself, kind of what's your cup of tea? Are we just going to rip the Band-Aid and dig in and do this for 2 to 3 weeks, let the new taste buds come in, work? On the flip side, maybe we're going to take it slow and steady. And over the next couple weeks, you're going to start to raid your pantry and raid your freezer, raid your fridge, figure out what some of the highest sodium products are in the house, and say this next week, I'm going to tackle the bread aisle and the cracker aisle, and I'm going to look for some lower sodium options. And then next week, maybe it's going to be broth and soup. And then the next week, it's going to be canned vegetables. And then over the course of, let's say, a month to 2 months, you've been able to tackle your entire kitchen, but it didn't feel like you had to throw away every single thing in the house, that rip the band-aid because it doesn't work for you and you're just kind of bitter because your food doesn't taste so good. But now it's just this slow and steady progress. And 2 months from now, you went from 4,000 milligrams a day to 2,000 milligrams a day. Boom, smooth sailing. I have included some recipes here that are going to be on the lower sodium side of things. I will say this when it comes to a daily allotment, ideally, we introduce sodium into our body equally distributed across the day. So if we use the American Heart Association recommendation of about 1,500 milligrams, 3 meals a day, that gets us to about 500 milligrams for breakfast, 500 for lunch, 500 for dinner. So you're going to see these recipes that I've given you are all at or below that 500 amount because it's a nice kind of easy way to chunk up the day. Do know though that if you happen to eat a higher salt or higher sodium meal, let's say for breakfast, you go out, you're at Webb's, and you're going to get a bunch of stuff, bacon and sausage, and you know that the sodium's really high. Not all is lost. You can absolutely kind of equalize that through the rest of the day by making really intentional low sodium options for your lunch, your dinner, and your snack. So this one recipe, white bean and tomato bruschetta, you will see that I have picked a lot of canned, really convenient options. They're all going to be low sodium or reduced sodium, whatever you can find in your store. And we want to make sure that we are draining and rinsing all of them to help cut that sodium content as much as possible. We've got a creamy chicken salad. This is kind of my spin on a overall healthier version. It's also a lower sodium option because we're not using mayonnaise. We are going to be using non-fat plain Greek yogurt mixed with avocado, both creamy, both not super flavorful. That the plain yogurt will give a little bit of tang, but then we're adding in things like grapes to help balance that out. We're using a little bit of pepper. I like to add garlic powder to almost everything. So I would add a little bit of garlic powder to this recipe. You're just mixing all of these things together. And then instead of serving that chicken salad on a bread or toast, I've served it on greens to help get some more fresh green vegetables. If you did make this, you could absolutely serve it on bread or crackers. Again, looking for those low sodium varieties. I have here a box of biscuits, hint of salt. There's only 50 milligrams of sodium for 6 crackers. The standard Triscuit is going to be much higher than that. Other types of crackers can be much higher than that as well. So those options are out there so that you can have these low sodium meals. You can see that this recipe, just so you know, it does make about 4 servings. 300 milligrams of sodium for the whole thing. If you were to add these low sodium Triscuit at only 50 milligrams for the 6, you're not at 350 for the meal. We're shooting for less than or right about 500 a meal. Totally doable. And then the last one I have on here is a chicken broccoli casserole with whole wheat pasta. This casserole does serve 6. You will see down there that the sodium per serving is right at that 450, and this is a complete meal. We are using whole wheat pasta. This is going to be a higher fiber, just more nutritious option, remembering that those whole grains are part of the DASH diet, so this is the way we could add those whole grains in. I've got skinless chicken breast here. You could do something like a low sodium canned chicken. Some folks, maybe we don't have access to fresh chicken or the price point of it. Low sodium canned chicken would be an option. I've used the Mrs. Dash salt-free Italian spice blend. You can also use that Italian spice mix that I had on that previous slide. Again, we're using really easy and convenient things. Those canned corn. Again, we want the no salt added or the low sodium, drained and rinsed as always. And then we're using frozen broccoli. 16-ounce package minimum. If you want to add more, you can. I'm always a fan of doubling or at least doing 1.5 the amounts of vegetables in a casserole dish because it all fits in the 13 by 9, easy peasy. And we're just bumping up that vegetable amount so that we are going to maybe cut the carbs by using less pasta or potatoes or whatever other things you might be putting in there. But this is standard instructions for casserole. And like I said, per serving, only 450, and it's the whole meal, easily within those 500 milligrams that you might be shooting for per meal throughout the day. In terms of snacks, since I didn't mention that, general rule of thumb is obviously keep it as low sodium as possible. If you're going to try to aim for no more than 200 milligrams per snack, you do 1 or 2 snacks a day in line with those meals. You're coming in somewhere between 1,500 and 1,900 milligrams a day, both well underneath the dietary guideline recommendation of no more than 2,300 for the day. Just kind of an easy way to break that out. Like I mentioned, we do have some extra resources from the American Heart Association. I did include that website there. Lots of really great free recipes, lots of different ways to kind of weed them out. If you're looking for new chicken recipes, you can look up specifically low sodium. If you're looking for more vegetables, considering it's the American Heart Association, there's going to be some lower fat options. They're going to be overall very heart healthy selections. Really great resource to be looking for new recipes if you're looking for kind of new ways to do things, a new take or a lower sodium take on the stuff that you're